This is a fully verified true story regarding one of the most accidental financial discoveries in history. In April 2014, a family in Toulouse, France was dealing with a mundane, frustrating roof leak. To reach the source of the water, they forced open a sealed attic door that had been blocked by junk for generations. That specific piece of debris, used essentially as insulation against the damp wall, was not trash. It was a lost masterpiece valued at $170 million. However, turning that dirty canvas into 9 figures of liquid wealth exposes 3 massive paradoxes that we must solve. First, we have the mystery of the blind thieves. How did a team of burglars break into this exact attic years earlier, steal cheap silverware, and walk right past the $170 million object sitting in plain sight? Second, we have the mystery of the water. How did a catastrophic roof leak, which usually destroys property value, become the only reason this fragile masterpiece survived for centuries? And finally, the mystery of the market. Who had the courage to bet against the Louvre Museum and buy this painting in secret when the world's top experts called it a fake? To understand the sheer scale of this discovery, you have to understand the annoyance that started it. It wasn't the treasure map, it was water dripping on the floor. The owners of this historic home in Toulouse were not looking for art, they were looking for a roofer. The leak was persistent, damaging the structure and forcing them to access a crawl space that hadn't been opened since the days of horse-drawn carriages. The door to the sub-attic was jammed tight. It wasn't locked with a key, it was physically blocked by heavy objects that had been shoved against it from the inside and forgotten by ancestors who clearly didn't believe in spring cleaning. Only in France does a roof leak lead to a Renaissance masterpiece. In my house, it leads to mold. But for this family, that water was liquid luck. When they finally muscled the door open, pushing aside the heavy obstruction, they found the source of the blockage. It was a massive canvas, nearly 6 feet wide, leaning casually against the wet brickwork. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, fireplace soot, and rat droppings. To the family, it looked like standard attic junk, maybe an old piece of scenery from a school play or just a bad painting an uncle made. It was being used, quite literally, as a piece of drywall to stop the draft. Using a Caravaggio to block a door is the ultimate flex. It is the kind of accidental arrogance that you only see in old money families who've lost track of their own inventory. The family dragged the heavy object out into the light, not to admire it, but to get it out of the way so the plumbers could work. Underneath the grime, however, was a scene of shocking violence, a woman taking the life of a general. It was dark, intense, and terrifyingly realistic. They didn't know it yet, but they were staring at Judith beheading Holofernes, a lost work by the Italian master Caravaggio, painted in 1607. Finding a Caravaggio in the attic is like finding a winning lottery ticket inside an old pizza box. The contrast between the container and the content is impossible for the brain to process. The family was standing there, likely covered in dust, worrying about the cost of roof tiles, while holding an asset that was worth more than the gross domestic product of a small island nation. This wasn't just a painting, it was a winning lottery ticket that had been printed 400 years ago and left to cure in the dark. It was the ultimate thrift store haul, except the thrift store was their own house. But the most insane part of the story isn't the discovery, it's the near miss that happened years prior. This house had been burglarized.
Thieves had broken in, climbed into the attic, and rummaged through the family's belongings. They took candlesticks, perfume bottles, and anything that glittered. They stood inches away from this canvas. They likely touched it to move it aside, and they decided it was worthless. They left it behind because it was too big, too dirty, and too scary. The burglars walking past the painting is like someone breaking into a bank and stealing the pens. It is a level of incompetence that is almost poetic. Those thieves walked away with maybe a few thousand euros in stolen goods, leaving behind a net worth transformation of $170 million. Imagine being the burglar who stole the silverware but left the $170 million painting. That's going to keep you up at night. It proves that value is not obvious. Value is a secret language that you have to learn to speak. The family, however, wasn't celebrating yet. They were terrified. Once the initial shock wore off, they realized they had a massive problem. They were in possession of a rare collectible that was completely unprotected. Their standard homeowner's insurance covered fire and theft of normal items, like televisions and sofas. It did not cover a 9-figure high-value item that was technically a national treasure. If the roof leak had gotten worse and dripped on the canvas instead of near it, they would have lost a fortune with zero recourse. Walking past $170 million is the definition of fumbling the bag, but the family was determined not to make the same mistake as the thieves. They were currently asset-rich but cash-poor. They had this massive thing, but they couldn't eat it, they couldn't spend it, and they couldn't even tell their neighbors about it for fear of being robbed again. This created a high-stakes pressure cooker environment inside the house.
They needed an appraisal, and they needed it fast. But calling an expert meant alerting the world that there was gold in the attic. A hidden gem in the attic is a time capsule that pays dividends, but only if you can get it authenticated. The family knew that old doesn't automatically mean valuable. Plenty of old paintings are worth less than the canvas they are painted on. They needed to know if this was a copy, a fake, or the real deal. They called a local auctioneer, Mark Labarbe, hoping for good news but expecting to be told it was a nice 19th century copy worth a few €1,000. I check my attic every day now. Still nothing but insulation and disappointment. But for this family, the call to Labarbe was the first step in a 5-year war. They were about to enter a world of valuation battles, forensic science, and international intrigue. They were about to find out that having found money is actually a full-time job. The burglars are definitely the unluckiest people in this story. Negative IQ move, but their ignorance was the family's salvation. If the thieves had been smarter, the painting would have been cut out of its frame and sold on the black market for pennies decades ago. The irony is thick. The same neglect that covered the painting in dust protected it from light damage. The same junk that blocked the door protected it from being thrown out during renovations. And the same ignorance that blinded the thieves saved the asset for the rightful owners. Everything that seemed like a problem conspired to keep the painting safe until the exact moment the market was ready for it. The moment the local auctioneer, Mark Labarbe, stepped into the attic, the atmosphere in the house shifted from annoyance to absolute terror. The family had gone from needing a roofer to needing a crisis management team in the span of a single afternoon. They were experiencing a textbook case of sudden wealth syndrome.
This is a psychological condition usually reserved for lottery winners or tech IPO beneficiaries, characterized by a paralyzing mix of euphoria and paranoia. They had a dirty canvas leaning against the wall that was potentially worth more than the entire neighborhood combined, yet they still had to decide what to cook for dinner. It was a cognitive dissonance that would break most people. Sudden wealth syndrome must be nice. I currently have sudden bill syndrome, where the only thing accumulating rapidly is my credit card debt. But for this family, the stress was visceral. They were suddenly asset-rich and cash-poor. This is a dangerous financial position where your net worth on paper is astronomical, but your liquidity is zero. They couldn't buy groceries with a slice of the painting. They were effectively starving billionaires, trapped in a house with a winning ticket they couldn't cash and couldn't protect. They were terrified that word would get out. If the burglars from years ago knew what they missed, they might come back with a truck instead of a bag. Being cash poor and asset rich is like starving to death while locked inside a grocery store. The family immediately realized they had an insurance policy problem. Their standard coverage was laughable in the face of this discovery. You cannot just call up a standard provider and say, "By the way, I found a Baroque masterpiece next to the Christmas decorations." They needed specialized high-value item insurance, which requires appraisals, security systems, and premiums they likely couldn't afford. Imagine the insurance agent taking that call. "You found a what? In the where? Ma'am, does the attic have a smoke detector?" The absurdity of the situation required immediate professional intervention. Mark Labarbe, the local auctioneer, knew he was looking at something significant. He saw the violence in the brushstrokes, the mastery of the light, the sheer darkness of the composition. He recognized the style immediately, chiaroscuro. This is the dramatic contrast between light and dark that Caravaggio made famous. It wasn't just a painting, it was a theatrical performance on canvas. I think of chiaroscuro as the theater spotlight hitting the actor's face in a pitch-black room. It focuses your attention with brutal intensity, leaving everything else in the shadows. Labarbe knew this was beyond his pay grade. He wasn't going to guess on a 9-figure asset. He picked up the phone and called the heavy artillery, Eric Turquin in Paris.
Turkin is not just an art expert, he is a titan of the old master market, a man whose word can make or break a fortune. When Turkin saw the initial snapshot sent via email, he didn't wait for a formal appointment. He reportedly got in his car and drove. Eric Turkin driving to Toulouse immediately is the most relatable part. I drive faster for pizza, but Turkin was driving for history. He covered the 420 miles from Paris to Toulouse with the urgency of a first responder. This wasn't a casual consultation, it was a rescue mission. When he arrived, the painting was still there, leaning against the wall, imposing and dusty. He looked at it, he looked at the family, and he knew. He didn't confirm it was a Caravaggio right then, that would take years of science, but he confirmed it was a masterpiece of the 17th century worth investigating. The painting was immediately moved. It was packed, secured, and transported to Turkin's vault in Paris for a secret investigation that would last 2 years. During this time, the family had to live in silence. They couldn't tell their friends. They couldn't post about it. They just had to wait while scientists and historians dissected their attic junk. A major part of this investigation was establishing provenance. Provenance is the history of ownership. It is the paper trail that proves a painting isn't stolen property or a clever forgery.
Provenance is the pedigree. It's the difference between a stray dog and a show dog. Without it, you just have a pretty picture. With it, you have a historical artifact. The family dug into their own history and found a potential link. They had an ancestor who was an officer in Napoleon's army. He had served in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, a time when looting art was basically a standard military perk. The theory was that this ancestor bought or liberated the painting in Spain and brought it back to Toulouse, where it was shoved in the attic and forgotten. Think of provenance like the title deed for a car. Without it, you might be driving a stolen vehicle and no one will buy it from you. The ancestor story gave the painting a legitimate reason to be in that house. It explained the gap in history. It explained why it wasn't in a museum. It was a war souvenir that turned into a family heirloom, then into clutter, and finally into a trust fund. The fact that this soldier didn't sell it, didn't display it, and didn't even mention it in a will is the only reason it survived. I bet the family argued about who had to go up and fix the leak. Best chore ever. I don't want to do it, it's dark up there. Just go, you might find $100 million. It changes the dynamic of household chores forever. But as the excitement settled into a long waiting game, the family faced the reality of estate planning. If this painting was real, their simple will was now a ticking bomb of tax liability. They needed a family office to manage the complexity of a fortune that hadn't even materialized yet. This waiting period is the hardest part of sudden wealth. You are mentally spending the money, but physically you are still clipping coupons. The family had to trust Turkin completely. They handed over their financial future to a man they had just met, hoping he could convince the world that the dirty canvas was the real deal, and Turkin was ready to fight.
He knew the art world would be skeptical. He knew the Louvre would be difficult. He was preparing for a war of authentication. Meanwhile, the thieves who had raided the house years earlier were presumably still out there, completely unaware of the opportunity cost of their ignorance. They had walked away with peanuts while the elephant was in the room. The family's anxiety about security was valid, but the greatest threat to the painting wasn't theft anymore, it was skepticism. The painting had to survive the scrutiny of the world's most cynical critics. My attic just has dead spiders and a box of cables I'm too afraid to throw away. If I called an expert to look at my attic, they would charge me a hazardous waste disposal fee. But this family had turned a concept of storage into a high-stakes investment strategy. As the painting sat in the Paris lab, undergoing the first rounds of cleaning, the true quality of the work began to emerge from beneath the soot. It was time to bring in the machines. The human eye wasn't enough. They needed to see what was underneath the paint. And for that, they would need a very large and very unusual medical facility. The technical analysis hit a bizarre logistical snag almost immediately. The canvas was huge, measuring nearly 6 feet wide. It was simply too large for the standard infrared and X-ray scanners used in art labs in Paris. The team needed a machine designed for something massive, and they found one in the most unlikely place imaginable. They took the $170 million painting to the Maison Alfort Veterinary School, just outside Paris. They had to use the high-powered radiography equipment designed for horses and large cattle just to see through the layers of paint.
I love how they took a $170 million painting to the vet. Did they check it for fleas too? It sounds like a joke, but this crossover episode was crucial.
X-raying in art at a vet school is the crossover episode I didn't know I needed. The images returned from the horse scanner revealed the painting's deepest secret, its definitive proof of originality, pentimenti. This is an Italian term that translates to regrets. It refers to the changes an artist makes on the canvas while painting, altering the composition as they work. The pentimenti sounds like a type of pasta, but apparently it's worth millions. In technical terms, the pentimenti are like the track changes in a Word document. It shows the artist was editing as he went. A copyist, someone painting a replica to sell, never makes these changes. They know exactly where the hand goes. They know exactly where the eye looks. They just copy what they see. The creator, however, is fighting with the image. The X-rays show that the artist of the Toulouse canvas had originally painted Judith's eyes looking in a different direction and had adjusted the position of her fingers. Authentication is a courtroom trial where the painting is the defendant and history is the judge. The pentimenti were the star witness. They proved that this wasn't a static copy, it was a dynamic creation. This evidence was backed up by another discovery, the technique of risparmio. This is where the artist leaves parts of the dark prepared background visible to serve as the shadows in the final image. It requires immense speed and confidence. You can't hesitate. The analysis showed that the Toulouse painter worked fast, aggressively, and with a specific economy of paint that Caravaggio was known for in his later, desperate years. The restoration process was the next step, and it was terrifyingly delicate. It was like archaeological surgery on a patient made of canvas. The restorer wasn't repainting the image, they were removing 400 years of fireplace soot, nicotine, and dust. They used tiny cotton swabs and custom solvents to lift the grime without touching the original pigment.
As the layers came off, the team was shocked. Despite the leaking roof, the rats, and the attic dampness, the painting was in exceptional condition. The painting was in mint condition because the dirt acted like bubble wrap for 200 years. Leaving a painting in a damp attic for 150 years is my kind of conservation strategy. The thick layer of filth had actually sealed the surface, protecting the oil paint from oxygen and light. If the family had cleaned it in the 1920s with harsh chemicals, they would have destroyed it. The neglect was the best thing that could have happened to the asset. The varnish on the painting was like sunglasses that had gotten darker for 2 centuries, and now that they were removed, the colors screamed with violence and life. However, the painting lacked one crucial thing, a signature. Caravaggio rarely signed his work. This is a nightmare for valuation. If it's not signed, is it real? My mom writes my name on my underwear, so that's provenance. But for a masterpiece, you rely on connoisseurship, the expert's eye. Turquine had to rely on the stylistic DNA of the painting. He pointed to the psychological depth of Judith. In the famous version in Rome, Judith looks hesitant, almost disgusted by the tragic act. In this new version, she looks determined, staring directly at the viewer or out of the frame. It was a psychological shift that matched Caravaggio's own darkening mind in 1607. This lack of a signature meant that the scientific analysis had to be bulletproof. They analyzed the pigments. They found Naples yellow and specific red ochres that were chemically identical to those used in Caravaggio's other Neapolitan works. There were no anachronisms, no modern pigments like titanium white, which would have instantly flagged it as a fake. Every chemical test came back consistent with the early 17th century.
The investment-grade art market demands certainty, and the science was providing it, pixel by pixel. But science can only prove age, not authorship. It could still be a painting from 1607 by a brilliant nobody. This is where the pentimenti became the anchor of the argument. Turquine argued that no nobody paints with that level of confidence and revision. The identical twin problem, the existence of a copy by Louis Finson, actually helped. The Finson copy was stiff. This version was fluid. The energy was different. It was the difference between a live concert and a recording. Eric Turquine was now ready to bet his career. He had the X-rays from the vet, the chemical analysis from the lab, and the provenance theory from the family. He prepared to announce the discovery to the world. He knew the backlash would be severe. He was about to claim he found a holy grail of art history in a leaky attic. He was putting a target on his back for every critic in London and New York. The timing was ironic. While the painting was being hailed as a miracle of survival in the lab, the family was still dealing with the practical reality of the leak that started it all. The water that threatened the canvas was the catalyst. If the roof had held for another 10 years, the dampness might have finally rotted the canvas. The discovery happened in the exact window where restoration was still possible.
It was a narrow escape from total destruction. The burglars, in their infinite wisdom, had missed the mint-condition masterpiece because they judged the book by its cover, or rather the painting by its dust. Their inability to see past the surface-level grime cost them the heist of the century. The family, meanwhile, was preparing for the next phase, the public battle. They had the science, but they needed the market's approval. And the first hurdle was the biggest one, the French government and the Louvre Museum.
Just as the scientific evidence was beginning to mount in Eric Turquin's favor, the French government intervened with a move that was both a blessing and a curse. In 2016, the Ministry of Culture officially designated the painting a national treasure. On paper, this sounds like the highest honor a nation can bestow upon a piece of art. It validates the importance of the object, elevating it from attic junk to cultural heritage. However, in practice, for a family desperate for cash, it was a financial nightmare. This classification triggered an automatic export ban. It meant the painting could not leave French soil. It could not be sold to a Russian oligarch, an American hedge fund manager, or a Middle Eastern royalty. The global market was effectively shut down. National treasure status is like golden handcuffs. You're special, but you can't leave the house. The family was suddenly trapped in a cage with their own asset. The law gave the French state, and specifically the Louvre Museum, an exclusive 30-month window to acquire the piece. For 2.5 years, the family could not entertain other offers. They had to sit and wait while the museum decided their fate. The government even set a theoretical price tag, 120 million euros. It was a take-it-or-leave-it scenario. The family had to maintain the insurance, the security, and the stress, all while the Louvre took its sweet time analyzing the canvas. That national treasure status sounds fancy until you realize it just means you can't sell this. It's the bureaucratic equivalent of a friend zoning. The family was essentially told, "We love you, you're amazing, but we need 30 months to decide if we want to date you." This period was agonizing. The family was still dealing with the costs of the discovery. They had hired lawyers, tax specialists, and security guards. Their burn rate was high, and their income from the painting was zero.
They were living on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a government committee to either save them or push them off. Then, in 2018, the clock ran out. The 30-month window closed, and the Louvre made its announcement. They were declining the offer to purchase. They were passing on the Caravaggio from the attic. It was an absolute bombshell. The most prestigious art institution on the planet had the exclusive right to buy a lost masterpiece by one of the most famous painters in history, and they said no. The rejection was public, humiliating, and financially catastrophic. The official reason was never explicitly stated in a press release, but the subtext was clear. They weren't convinced. The Louvre rejecting it is the ultimate "it's not you, it's me" breakup text. It was a polite way of saying, "We think this might be a fake, and we aren't spending our entire acquisition budget on a maybe." The museum's curators were reportedly divided. Some believed it was the real deal. Others believed it was a high-quality copy by Louis Finson. Without a unanimous consensus, the museum, which is risk-averse by nature, chose safety over glory. They didn't want to be the museum that bought a 120 million euro fake. The Louvre playing hard to get and then losing the painting is peak French drama. It was a decision that would haunt them, but at the moment, it felt like the final nail in the coffin for the painting's value. The critics who had been skeptical from the start felt vindicated. Prominent art critics like Jonathan Jones had called the painting coarse and unconvincing. With the rejection of the Louvre, the painting's reputation was in tatters. It was now the painting the Louvre didn't want. In the collectibles market, doubt is poison. If the experts don't believe, the billionaires don't buy. The skeptics were like hecklers at a comedy show trying to ruin the performance. They were loud, they were confident, and they were driving the price down.
The family was devastated. They had gone from potential national heroes to the owners of a very expensive, very controversial piece of canvas. The export ban was lifted, meaning they could now sell it internationally, but who would buy damaged goods? The Louvre's no was a stamp of disapproval that was visible from space. But Eric Turquin was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had staked his entire 40-year reputation on this authentication.
he decided to pivot. If the French establishment wouldn't buy it, he would take it to the open market. He announced a massive public sale, but instead of sending it to Christie's or Sotheby's in London or New York, he made a shocking decision. He decided to auction the painting right there in Toulouse, with Marc Labarbe, the local auctioneer who found it. It was a brilliant, if risky, piece of marketing. He framed it as a David versus Goliath story. The Paris elite had rejected it. Now the world could decide. He sent the painting on a global tour to build hype. It went to London. It went to New York. He invited the world's top collectors to come and see for themselves. He was betting that the market risk would be outweighed by the sheer beauty of the object. He was betting on the greed and the ego of private collectors. The art world is just 5 guys in a room deciding if something is trash or treasure. Turkin knew that he didn't need the Louvre, he just needed 2 billionaires who hated each other to get in a bidding war. He set the estimate at up to $170 million, ignoring the Louvre's lower valuation. He was effectively telling the market, the museum is wrong and you can prove it. To add fuel to the fire, rumors began to circulate that the auction might have no reserve. A reserve price is the hidden minimum price a seller will accept. If the bidding doesn't reach it, the item doesn't sell. Selling without a reserve is terrifying.
It means if the only bid is $10, the painting sells for $10. It was a bluff designed to signal supreme confidence. A no-reserve auction is like jumping out of a plane without checking if the parachute works. It forces the buyers to take the sale seriously because they know the item will be sold that day. The tension in Toulouse was electric. The world's press descended on the city. The auction catalog was printed with the Caravaggio on the cover. The date was set for June 27, 2019. If the Louvre's passed, does that mean I can afford it? Asking for a friend. The public was fascinated by the sheer gamble of it all. The attribution debate turned into a global spectacle. Turkin was on television debating critics. The painting was displayed in a special showroom with dramatic lighting. The narrative had shifted from "is it real?" to "how much will it fetch?" The attribution debate was a tug of war with $170 million tied to the rope. On one side, the academic establishment. On the other, the commercial market. The family was caught in the middle, their financial goals hanging by a thread. They were exhausted. They just wanted it over. They wanted the lump sum payment that would change their lives, but they feared a public humiliation if no one bid. The atmosphere in the days leading up to the auction was thick with anxiety. Every major hedge fund manager and art collector was watching. The smart money was doing its own due diligence. They were flying in their own experts, ignoring the Louvre's opinion and looking at the pentimenti for themselves. The stage was set for the biggest showdown in auction history. And then, 48 hours before the hammer was set to fall, the phone rang. It wasn't a bidder registering for the auction. It was an offer. A serious, massive, confidential offer to buy the painting immediately, canceling the auction entirely. The auction was set. The stage in Toulouse was built.
The world's press had booked their flights, and then, with just 48 hours on the clock, the entire event was abruptly canceled. The announcement was a single terse statement. The painting had been sold. The public spectacle was over before it began. The climax happened in secret, behind closed doors, leaving the art world in a state of shock. This development finally answered the third major question about the painting's fate. The painting was pulled from the public block and sold in a private treaty sale. A private treaty sale is like skipping the line at the nightclub because you know the owner. Instead of battling it out in the public arena with paddles in the air, risking a no sale or a low price, a single buyer went backstage and made an offer so good the family simply could not refuse. The exact price was strictly confidential, bound by non-disclosure agreements that are tighter than military secrets. However, all major financial outlets reported the figure to be in the range of $100 to $150 million. Private sale sounds so shady, like a briefcase exchange in a dark alley. But in the high-stakes world of hedge funds and asset allocation, it is the preferred method for the ultra-wealthy. It guarantees privacy and speed. The buyer didn't want a bidding war, he wanted the asset. The private sale was a sniper shot, clean, quiet, and effective. In an instant, the family from Toulouse, who had spent 5 years worrying about insurance premiums and legal fees, became unimaginably wealthy. This is the very definition of winning the lottery without ever buying a ticket. This was the attic lottery.
The family went from "we need a roofer" to "we need an entire wealth management firm" in a single afternoon. They now needed an entire team of professionals to handle a lump sum payment that was larger than the budgets of most small towns. They needed wealth management, which is the ship captain you hire after you find the treasure. You may have the gold, but you need a fiduciary advisor to help you navigate the financial storms and not sink the ship. A fiduciary advisor is like a personal trainer for your wallet who can't lie to you. That person is legally required by law to put your financial health and financial goals above their own profits. This was not the time to take a recommendation from a random cousin. I need a fiduciary advisor just to manage my monthly streaming subscriptions. But for this family, the stakes were generational. They also needed immediate estate planning. Estate planning without a will is like trying to drive a car blindfolded with your family in the back seat. Without that map, the next generation could lose this entire fortune to infighting, legal battles, or massive avoidable taxes. I wonder if the family even had a moment to argue about it. One might say, "I say we sell." Another, "No, I want to keep it." The decision was settled. Okay, it's $150 million. We sell. The fact that they canceled the auction 48 hours before is so dramatic. Netflix needs this script. But the drama didn't end with the sale. The identity of the mystery buyer was the final piece of the puzzle. It revealed a delicious irony that settled the Louvre versus the world debate. The buyer was revealed to be J. Tomlinson Hill, an American billionaire and vice chairman of the Blackstone Group. But Hill wasn't just a hedge fund manager buying a trophy. He was and is a prominent member of the board of trustees for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. J. Tomlinson Hill buying it after the Louvre said no is purely a billionaire power move. It was a direct challenge to the French establishment. The Louvre, a state-funded institution paralyzed by caution and bureaucracy, was too afraid to take the risk. Tom Hill, a private patron of the Met, representing the aggressive American market, was not. The Met effectively told the Louvre to hold my beer. The painting that France rejected was now likely destined to hang in New York, validated by the very market forces that the academics despised. Honest question, do you pay capital gains tax if you sell it for cash in a parking lot? I wish. The reality for the family was a massive tax bill. Capital gains tax is basically the government taking a bite of your sandwich because you found it. In France, the tax regime is notoriously strict, but tax efficiency is the art of giving the government exactly what they're owed and not a penny more. The family likely used complex structures, perhaps involving charitable donations and trust funds, to minimize the hit. Trust funds are like financial bunkers built to protect money from your own bad decisions and from the taxman. The private deal also solved the problem of the gamble. A lump sum payment is like eating the whole cake at once. An annuity is having a slice every day. By taking the cash buyout, the family removed all future risk. They didn't have to worry if the painting was later proven to be a fake. They didn't have to worry if the art market crashed. They traded a volatile asset for cold, hard liquidity. Liquidity is how fast you can turn your toy into cash to buy groceries, and they had just achieved maximum liquidity. Which finally brings us back to our first and perhaps most ironic mystery. The burglars. Years before any art expert was called, a team of thieves broke into that house. They rummaged through that exact attic, stole items they deemed valuable, probably worth a few €1,000 total, and walked right past the Caravaggio. Their mistake is the perfect summary of the entire story. Value is not fixed. It is a matter of appraisal and belief. This is the ultimate lesson of valuation. A valuation isn't a fixed price, it's a weather forecast. It's an educated guess, but it can still rain. The burglars predicted clear skies, seeing nothing of value. The Louvre predicted clouds, seeing too much risk. But Eric Turkin and Tom Hill, they predicted a hurricane. The family from Toulouse managed to turn 400 years of attic dust into a generational fortune because they were willing to ask the question the thieves never did. What if this is real? At this point, I'm just investing in attics, not houses, just the attics. The story of the Toulouse Caravaggio is a reminder that the greatest assets are often hiding in plain sight, covered in dirt, waiting for someone with the vision to see them.
The burglars are definitely the unluckiest people in this story. Negative IQ move. They prove that you can be standing right next to a life-changing fortune and miss it completely if you don't know what you're looking for. So let me know in the comments, what was the most insane detail of this story? Was it the Louvre's massive public rejection, or was it the original burglars fumbling the score of a lifetime? And while you do that, check out our next investigation into the hidden economy of found treasures. If possible, like and subscribe.